If you answered yes to these 3 questions, then it's likely that you have been the victim of a witch's bridle. Now, they're known in Maine. About 100 years ago down in Kittery, they were demolishing an old derelict building, and inside one of the walls, one of the crew found a strange-looking bridle. It was about 9 feet long, and it was made of horsetail and yellow birch bark and tow rope. And they knew right away that they were looking at a witch's bridle, and they burned it on the spot. Because people around Kittery still remembered the time, about 80 years before, that Captain Perkins had a run-in with old Betty Booker. Now, this was a little while after the American War of Independence, and Skipper Perkins was a fairly successful fisherman, an old salt from Kittery. But he had the reputation of being the worst, most tight-fisted skinflint on the Maine coast, and that's going something. And one day he was walking home from the pier after a day's fishing with some of the catch in a net over his shoulder when he passed Betty Booker's house, and she came out. Now, old Betty Booker was, well, nobody knew how old Betty Booker was. She'd lived in that cottage for as long as anybody could remember, and they knew she was a widow, but nobody even knew how long she'd been a widow or remembered who her husband, Mr. Booker, was. He was probably a fisherman. Because in those days there were a lot of, single old men and women around, and, widows, widowers, more widows. And people were more community-minded, and it was just kind of a given that they might bring the older person the occasional vegetables from the garden or, some wood for the fire. So now old Betty Booker came up and she touched Skipper Perkins' arm and she said, "Can you give me a bit of halibut, Skipper?" But Skipper Perkins looked at her and said, "Show me your 6pence, madam." And he began to walk away, and well, old Betty Booker scowled. And she began to shake her long gray locks, and they just snaked around her head like Medusa, and then she began to mutter something under her breath. And at that moment, Skipper Perkins' net split right in two, spilling the fish all over the sidewalk. And Betty Booker began to cackle and howl with laughter while he tried to pick them up, but they just kept squishing and slipping out of his reach. But finally he gathered enough of them up, and as he tried to walk away, she called after him, "Good fishing tomorrow, Captain!" And sure enough, the next morning he went out with his boat and his crew, and the only luck Skipper Perkins had was bad luck. The wind tore at their sails, and the waves beat at the boat, and the fish seemed to just slip right out of his trawls. And then the men began getting seasick, and by the time they all limped back into port, they were poorer than when they set out. And Skipper Perkins was trudging home when again he saw old Betty Booker, and she said, "Did you bring me a bit of halibut, Skipper?" "Go to hell, you old hag," he said, and he began to walk off, and she called out to him, "I'll be riding you down to York one night soon, Skipper. Just wait till the next big storm." And he just walked away, but he wasn't fooling anybody. Skipper Perkins was terrified. And for the next few nights, he always made sure to get home before dusk. And he would double bar his front door, which was built to face the sea. But one night, there was a big nor'easter that raged up and down the coast, and Skipper Perkins was sitting in his bed with the covers over him, just listening to the wind howling and staring at that front door. And then the wind began to shriek, and above the wind he could hear the laughter of Betty Booker. And then, as he watched in horror, he heard the sound of, it sounded like 100 claws scratching on the door, and then the door began to slide open. And then, as he ran to the door to try to push it shut, he could feel the wind and the rain just splatter his face, and he tried to push, and on the other side of the door he could hear cackling laughter of several women. And he pushed with all his might, but the door began to just slide back and back. And so he leaped away from the door, and he jumped into the bed, and the door slammed open with a bang, and in trooped Betty Booker with 6 or 7 of her cronies. And they walked right up to the bed, and they pounced on Skipper Perkins, and they threw him out of the bed, and they stripped him naked. And then she took out her witch's bridle and threw it over his head, and she climbed up onto his back. and her cronies climbed up onto her back. And off they went out the door and into the teeth of the storm, and they rode Skipper Perkins all night long, all the way down to York. And whenever he flagged, they dig their claws into his back. And by the time they got him home, he was more dead than alive. And by the time they dragged him back and they threw him on the floor, and Betty Booker looked down at him as he lay shivering there and said, "Never say sixpence, Skipper, to a poor old woman again." And with that, she and her familiars vanished into the night. Well, Skipper Perkins took to his bed, and they say it took him 3 weeks to recover. Now, I'd like to be able to tell you that after his experience, Skipper Perkins became a little more generous, but hey, old habits die hard, and not everybody changes. But he did change one thing. From that day on, whenever he walked home from the waterfront, he always took a different route, one that didn't take him past old Betty Booker's house.